Well, good morning, everyone from all over the world joining us for the session number 3, the world as democracies versus autocracies. It's not that simple. My name is Step Vassen, and I'm a correspondent for Al Jazeera in Europe. I'm talking to you from the peace city of Münster. This is in the western part of Germany. There was a G7 foreign ministers meeting here in the last couple of days. And of course, there was a lot of talk about democracy versus autocracy, the war in Ukraine, Russia, China. It was all being debated here, all very relevant today. And before we go into a discussion with the panelists about this very relevant and hot topic, I want to invite the honorable former Prime Minister of Norway, Erna Solberg, to give a keynote speech. She was the Prime Minister in 2013 until 2021. And she's now the leading opposition leader. So welcome to Mrs. Solberg. The floor is yours.
And thank you so much for the invitation to this global town hall session. Right now, I'm in South Korea. I'm close to the North Korean dictatorship, which is the longest, I think, lasting autocracy regime after the Second World War. Tensions have been rising this week. And I think there's no place in the world where you can see the difference between the prosperity of South Korea compared to the devastating situation in North Korea as examples of why you also need to always have a support by your people in a democratic arena, by my meanings, to make sure that you can go the right way to develop also on all the other perspectives of a society. In President Joe Biden's State of the Union speech earlier this year, he pointed to the intensified battle between democracy and autocracy, referring to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And he called for a coalition of freedom-loving nations to counter aggressive nations and aggressive autocracies. I think we can conclude that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has indeed sharpened the divide between democracies and autocracies. The question that is facing us now is whether the war will gradually lead to a more pragmatic approach from the Western countries. But I would like to state that there are significant movements in a lot of the Western countries for pushing even harder on democratic values these days. I think you can answer the issue for this panel debate both with yes and no, and maybe, as it often is, it's the middle way that will be the answer to it all. But if I say that the war has shown us the consequences of not living up to our ideas of democratic values, because in 2014, the illegal annexation of Crimea was met with condemnation, but the international response were nothing like the ones Russia has faced today. In hindsight, we can infer that a stronger reaction back then would have made it harder for Putin to launch a second invasion of Ukraine this year. And maybe it's because my generation of a lot of politicians who experienced first the Cold War, then the Berlin Wall demolishing, was too hopeful, even maybe a bit naive when it came to Russian ambitions. Our ignorance is now gone. Consequently, I think the war will lead to also a more idealistic commitment to democracy going forward, not at least among young people. We see this push even if you look at a thing like the coming World Championship of football, where football associations local in Norway are calling for a sort of a boycott of viewing it because of human rights in Qatar. But at the same time, if you look at what has happened after Ukraine, we can see some signs of realpolitik kicking in, that the situation in the energy markets in Europe is pushing democracies towards greater pragmatisms that can help counter Russia. The United States and some European states are reaching out to the Gulf states to replace Russian gas, softening their position towards imports from Venezuela. The United States used up considerable political capital trying to get the Gulf states to condemn Russia at the United Nations. And Secretary of State Antony Blinken traveled to the Middle East to press the region's authoritarian states into action against Russia. And French and German leaders are urging better cooperation between EU and China. Maybe this is also realistic because we all need to talk together to combat all of the other problems that we have together in this world, not just focus on the Ukrainian situation. But as a former prime minister of a Nordic country, the Nordic countries still continue to dominate the top of the democracy rankings. I would, however, like to underline the importance of keeping up our ideals high and not being submitted to too much pragmatism. The link between development on the one hand and democracy on the other hand is widely recognized by the international community. So we need human rights, we need the rule of law and democratic governance, which are key drivers of country's social and economic development. And they are crucial forces in improving the livelihood of the poorest and those who suffer discrimination and injustice. Human rights provide a framework for identifying and addressing inequalities and ensuring that no one is left behind. This includes safeguarding the rights of those who are the hardest to reach in our societies. It also ensures fundamental importance to ensure freedom of expression, of assembly and association, and the opportunity to protest against unfair treatment. And I'd like just to conclude with saying that I don't think it's possible to think for a long term that there isn't, that politicians or leaders of countries don't have to go back to the people and get their view on who is going to rule their country. I don't think it's impossible for the long run. We need to have legitimacy in our decision making, and the only way you can get that in the long term is to make sure that you ask your people for guidance and you ask them whether they will support you also in the future. And we need effective, accountable and transparent institutions to make sure that this is functioning in the right way. So I leave up to you to discuss where the world is going on all of these issues. But I don't think we should lose out on our values, even if it's higher gas and energy prices in all over Europe. But we also need to find a balance of how we can work together between countries who at this time seem to have governments that are not listening so much to their people and countries that are democratic in basic. And we have to remember that the basis of all of this is the individual human being in our world that need to have a say in the governing of their country and to make sure that they can better their position in life. So thank you for this opportunity to say some words in the beginning.
Thank you so much, Erna Solberg, talking to us from Seoul in South Korea. Yes, you're saying we have to keep the stance strong on democracy and don't go too much into pragmatism. Of course, this is going to be part of our discussion. I will now introduce our panelists. We have joining from Russia, Professor Andrei Bystritsky. He's the chairman of the board of the Foundation for Development and Support of the Valdai Discussion Club, which is a highly regarded think tank in Russia. We have from Nigeria, Yemi Adamole-Kun. She is the executive director of Enough is Enough. It's a good governance institution. She's also the senior associate for the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And in 2018 was named, her name came in a list of the most influential people from African descent. From China, we have Professor Henry Hio Wang. He's the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization, a global think tank, and also the counselor to the China State Council, which is China's cabinet. From France, somewhere in a rural area in France, we have Nicolas Tenzer. He's the chairman of the Center for Studies and Research on Political Decision. He's an expert on European foreign policy, and he held key positions in the French government. I want to go to China first. The first question is for Dr. Henry Hio Wang. Of course, China has been condemned for going more into an authoritarian direction. I want to ask you, especially also, we've seen Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, visiting Beijing yesterday. There was a lot of criticism on his visit as well, especially about the timing so soon after the Congress was taking place. So is China turning more into an autocracy, and is that a sustainable model?
Yes. Okay. Thanks for the invitation. And so I'm here to hear all those discussions. And also, I noticed the news. Chancellor Scholz visited China. Which I think got very positively received. I think in this part of the world, and also in many Western countries as well. So I think I agree with the topic of this is that it's autocracy or democracy is not that simple. We probably should not take a binary look at this world. I think what has actually been happening is that we have. I agree. I think the World Bank in the past has defined the world developed. They have a developed countries, less developed countries, developing countries. I think that's probably a right assessment. We have a different degree of development, but it's really too simplified, and it's too probably not very healthy to divide countries into a so-called democracy or autocracy. For example, China is actually also a democracy in a Chinese sense. They call it the whole people's democracy process, which means that China has, for example, they have grassroots election, village election, township election, and then they have on the government officials, they have this meritocracy practiced in China for a long time. That all the university students going into the government, they have to go through exams and election selection, so that they have to qualify. It's not that you make a great speech, you can be a president of a minister of a country. You have to really prove your track record that you're working in different parts of China, and you have to be elevated gradually through the ranks, proven
But
that
would you call, sorry to interrupt the professor, but would you call China an autocracy or not?
Of course not. China is a democratic, they have a consultative democracy, they have a whole people's democracy, they have a meritocracy. Democracy has different forms and formats. It's not just, one size fits all. It's definitely China. It's in its own sense. They have a democratic process. One of the core values is to have a democratic country in one of the core values of China. And I think this whole process of democratic process fits China very well. And that's why let's really compare the performance and the bottom line. In the last 4 decades, China became the second largest economy of the world, lifted 800 million people out of poverty, built the first class of infrastructure in the world, contribute over 38% of the global GDP growth in the last 10 years, and become the largest trading nation with 140 countries. What can be better of a system that can really generate all those achievements that is compatible to the Industrial Revolution or any achievement by the mankind? So I think
can I interrupt one more time? Because we've seen, of course, recently the Party Congress, Xi Jinping being appointed again as the president of China. Was that a democratic process?
Yeah, I think they have gone through the election selection. 2,300 delegates actually cast the ballots, and they have a process of voting. And then we have Chancellor Angela Merkel, 16 years in the office. So probably President Xi Jinping have another term, which is that is elected, and there's many examples like that. If he is competent, you can choose your own cabinet. You can really perform. I think people care about performance and the bottom line. If they really get what has been delivered, that's really a count. I mean, if China can continue the prosperity and continue to contribute to the world, I mean, that should be continued, and I think that's where the selection, the election counts in China.
Okay, thank you for your insights. I think these statements will lead to some more discussion later on. I would just want to go to my second panelist, and the second question, it's for Yemi Ademolekun. You, of course, have been campaigning for democracy and civil rights for a very long time. Do you agree, or do you think democracy is the right answer?
Not at all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. And I think that's the whole essence of this debate, that it's not as clear cut, it's not either or. So China, as the professor just said, is considered autocratic, but they consider themselves a democracy in a sense of how their leaders are thrown up. They don't talk about it in the general sense of the country. And I think for me, parallel to Nigeria, a democracy is not about elections. And unfortunately, in a lot of the global South, we've unfortunately paralleled democracy to elections. And the West actually has supported that. So you have a lot of Western or global North donor funding talking about democracy or propping up countries as long as they have elections, then they're considered to be democratic. It was very interesting also in the context of Russia and Ukraine. Putin wanted to make a statement about an annexation, did a referendum, quote unquote, as he had an election. So, 90 plus people supported his motion, but the idea was to validate what he wanted to do under the guise of an election. Nigeria is a democracy because we have elections, but it's quite autocratic, in my opinion, in the way the country is governed. We've seen examples also in the global South, like Brazil, which is currently dealing with a transition at the moment. So certainly it's not the paralleling democracies to elections is a challenge, and that's generally what is the conversation. So if you don't have an independent judiciary, if citizens don't know their rights and responsibilities, and when they do know them, they can't honor, they can't fight for them, they can't demand them, they're not enforced. They're not enforceable either by law or because your judiciary refuses to obey the laws of the land. In a country where institutions are quite weak, there's no checks and balances. So I think for me that therein lies the challenge. That if we look at democracy simple as a country that runs elections every 4 years, every 5 years, or in China's case, for them internally, where the political party in and of itself has a democratic process of throwing up leaders that go through a particular process, then I think we miss the larger conversation.
So what is democracy? What does it mean for you? What is it exactly?
Well, I mean, there are kind of definitions by scholars of what a democracy is. But for someone who is in a country that I don't consider democratic in its operations, we now talk a lot globally about shrinking civic space. In Nigeria, over almost a 6-month period, Twitter was banned because our president was upset that Twitter deleted a tweet of his and then banned Twitter for 6 months. So a country that doesn't have an independent judiciary, in Nigeria, for example, there are numerous cases where decisions in the courts are bought. So a decision goes to the highest bidder, people who have access. Our judicial system is not equitable. It's not equal access. That's what I'm looking for. So people don't have equal access to judiciary. So you don't have an independent judiciary. You have a government that does not obey its own laws, does not obey its own court judgments. That's not a democracy. And in a democracy, I think also quite importantly that we don't talk about a lot is what do the people understand as a system of government that they're in? One of the things we talk about at Enough is Enough is that a lot of Nigerian citizens, because of our military history and the fact that it's not taught as part of our curriculum, don't understand our constitution and therefore don't understand the powers that they have. So when you have voter turnout in certain areas of 10% or 20%, is that enough in terms of legitimacy for people to understand that they have the power to choose those who are in office? And then rule of law, and then a vibrant opposition. I think for me, those would be the elements that make up a functioning democracy.
Thank you very much. I think I now want to go to Professor Andrei Pestritsi from Russia, because of course, Russia has also been accused of going more into an autocracy, especially in the last term of Vladimir Putin. And now we're looking at the war. Do you agree with that? Is Russia going back in time or is it moving forward?
First of all, I think it's from science fiction novel, go back in time. And it's not possible. Everything is going forward. The question is in what direction? But in this case, I can say that Russia, of course, is not autocracy. Vast majority of Russian population support this government, no doubt. But principally, I would like to say that in contemporary world, we should be very, very careful because it's not easy to distinguish between autocracy and democracy. First of all, in ancient Greece, Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, they were against, not against directly, but they were very, they had a lot of doubts about democracy in ancient Athens. But in essence, there were 30,000 citizens. In contemporary United States, for instance, more than 3,100,000. It's a very interesting question how so many people can elect just one president, for instance. From my point of view, we have a serious problem with understanding of contemporary political organizations. Maybe better to speak about political organizations, because the main question, why do we need a political system, except democracy? Do we need it to preserve mankind, or is it designed to enable everyone to live their life happily? Or is it needed to some individuals to assert themselves, dominate others, and increase their wealth? It's a big, I'm not sure that all these motives can be reconciled. It's a big challenge for contemporary society. At the same time, okay, we can speak about democracy in political, in politics, but people spend a lot of time in the business, but there is no democracy in business. It's we cannot imagine it. Anyway, we live in complicated societies, and there are a lot of challenges. About Russia, I can say that Russian society, I think so, is still in transition period, because now we see only first generation of the Soviet Union. It's a very interesting process and a very interesting challenge for society.
But you call Russia a democracy, or because you said it's not an autocracy?
Russia is democracy, officially, and no doubt. Elections.
But does democracy also
elections,
not mean
majority population.
Sorry to interrupt, Professor.
Sorry?
Democracy, doesn't that also mean freedom of the press, freedom of speech, people free to speak?
Yes, it's there are a lot of media in Russia. It's crazy amount. Internet is absolutely, relatively free. Now there are some problems because due to military operation. But generally, it's not a big problem because I know there are a lot of rumors about freedom of speech in Russia, but practically...
Well, I've lived in Russia myself. I was a correspondent in Moscow, so I know the situation there, and I know that
in this case, you know, a lot of media, especially in the radio, internet is, I think, free. You can find everything.
Lots of websites are being blocked. You know that, right?
Approximately less than 1%. No. I know. After 24th of February, there are some restrictions. You're right. But I think it's no sense to overestimate it.
But I thought it was interesting. You were explaining what the democracy means for a person, right? But isn't one of the things that a human being wants is to be able to be free? Is that not an important element for democracy?
It's a very interesting question. How can distinguish freedom and democracy? It's a serious question about freedom and democracy. I can say that from my point of view, better to speak about political organization, to use this term, and to speak about system of values. It's much more important. From my point of view, the best time, the paradise, we could see many thousand years ago during hunters-gatherers. They were absolutely free, small groups, equal, even human rights. They cared about each other, and it was happy. But so-called Neolithic revolution many years ago destroyed our world totally and created civilization. So civilization means challenge and limits for human behavior. Civilization means hierarchy and position of person in this hierarchy. It's a very heavy channel. Democracy is in best case, democracy is compromise between freedom, human rights, laws, egoism, aggression, and so on and so on.
And this is all still, sorry to interrupt, but this is all still in balance in Russia, according to you. The freedom, the human rights, and also the structure of society.
Each society is trying to reach best compromise, best situation in this case. According to a very famous film, nobody's perfect. And it means, but I can say that a Russian society is very interesting for researchers, for understanding, because it's very live, very vivid society with very there are a lot of contradictions, of course, and there are a lot of wings in the Russian society. But I think that new generations are very, very active. They try to create happy and comfortable life for them. And but of course, there are obstacles on this way.
Yeah, a lot of people have left Russia. Hundreds of thousands recently, right? Since demobilization as well. A lot of people have been leaving Russia. So that doesn't sound like they're very happy.
First of all, I know people who left, then came back, then left, then came back. It's like it's typical process. Yes, some people left. There are a lot of reasons for this. How many? I don't know precise figures, and unfortunately, the problem is that we're living in the contemporary world, and the main problem of our communication environment. We're abandoned in information communication ocean, and the problem of navigation and trust in this situation is very complicated. Unfortunately,
sorry, can I interrupt? Sorry, because I need to move on. We will continue this discussion, I'm sure. I have to go to France now to Nicolas Tenzer. I saw an article from you about heavy cloud of peace. You have said in your article, saying actually that if we're going to negotiate a peace deal in Ukraine, that could even be more dangerous. So I'm really interested to hear your view on is this democracy, and is democracy worth going to war for? Are you with me, Mr. Tenzer? I don't know if he's hearing me. Well, he's not here at the moment. So maybe we just go to the next session. Basically, it's maybe I want to invite people, anyone here now, to respond to the previous speakers. Maybe Erna Solberg has something to say.
Yes, I think being a neighbor to Russia, I have to admit, I think it's very difficult for us to today say that Russia is a democracy. It's been moving away from democracy for a long, long time. It cracks down on its opposition. It has cracked down on free press. It's become an autocracy. It's become a Putin-run state. And even if people are voting because there's so much control over the media, I think you still have to admit that the significance of democracies is rule of law. It is the possibility to say your own meaning. It's the possibility to assemble. When the civil societies have been silenced in the way it have done to look at to become voices of the opposition on human rights, not on political opposition, but opposition on human rights, the individual freedoms. I think you just have to admit by time now that it's on the wrong path. It's not democratic anymore. It's an autocracy. But with the modern technology use, and I think this is the biggest challenge we all are facing now, that what we thought was social media's possibility to enlighten us, to make sure that the world became smaller. It's also been an arena where there's more control of people and more control of the information in a lot of countries, which makes it more difficult for democratic forces and human rights activists to work.
Thank you very much, Professor Wang. Have you any comments on our previous speakers?
Yes, thank you. I think that probably, with 2,000-3,000 years in history of mankind now, we probably need to upgrade democracy concept. Because I think we cannot just simply interpret that as one man, one vote, or every 3, 4 years, 5 years we do this kind of exercise with such a large population. In democracy, it means you have to be well educated, you have to be rightly informed, you have to make a right selection, and then so there's many elements to that. And I think now with the modern world, with the technology, we probably need to upgrade on that. For example, China has practiced thousands of years since Tang Dynasty, Sui Dynasty. They have this meritocracy. You have to pass the exam. So they are choosing by their passing exams, passing the tests. It's like a vote. You have to be passing the examination officers and a vast selection process to really come to the top. So that's another way of a democracy. And today, China, for the last 40 years, China joined globalization, the market economy, because even the latest Party Congress report said market have to play decisive role in the society. So market economy is a democratic economy. Every consumer, where to go, what to buy, what to choose, they are voting with the mobile phone payment every moment, every day. So, and also there's, as I was mentioned, there's another also the technology, social media, there's all kind of watch the stories of, criticizing different opinions, different information. And then we're also living in a world democracy. The world is about 200 some countries and regions. US is the largest opposition party of China. China is watched by thousands of media, different countries, different NGOs. So you see the concept of democracy cannot be just simply interpreted as, just you have to do this every 4 years, use a voting ballot to do that. There's quite complicated now. So I think we need a complete process of democracy so that we can really have the bottom line is satisfy of your voters, satisfy your people, and deliver economic performance, and then really let people have a better life. China now, for the last 4 decades, has built the world's largest education system, largest social health system, largest social security system and health system. That's an enormous achievement, So really, we should measure the performance of different merits of democracy, rather than say, you are not democracy, we are democracy. But just like Deng Xiaoping said, doesn't matter if it's white cat, black cat, as long as it catches mice. So I think,
I think you made your point. Yes, it's very clear. What do you think about this, Yemi? Is that something you can agree with?
Yeah, I was just going to say, on this matter, I agree with Dr. Wang. So we might debate China's status as a democracy, but on the point of rethinking, deliberately rethinking what a democracy is and talking about it in those terms is really very important. In countries where literacy is quite low and everyone has the right to vote, is that necessarily the best choice for the people, given the context of what they know or understand about what a democracy is? And what are we then doing deliberately to educate people about their powers? The challenges we find in autocratic environments is that it is in the autocrat's interest to keep people uneducated. either, I mean, there's a popular phrase we say in Nigeria that poverty is weaponized, because when people are poor, the choices that they're able to make are not necessarily in their own best interest. They're making choices for what it is that is an immediate need, to meet an immediate need. And the promises of democracy are long-term. So China talks a lot about the people who's been lifted out of poverty, building the largest this, largest that. By function of the size of the country, yeah, quite understandable. But at what cost to the people? And what do the people in China think in terms of what that means for them? So, but on Dr. Wang's point about rethinking what a democracy is and how we talk about it, how we teach about it, I do agree with him on that.
Because is that, if I'm listening to you, you say that's actually something that only an educated population can have, a democracy?
No, not at all. I'm just saying that the choices that an educated population make is much different than the choices that a poor population will make. So in a country where it's almost a deliberate attempt to keep people poor and uneducated, and then you're campaigning in languages, for example, that they don't understand. For example, my organization has hosted or co-hosted the most number of debates in Nigeria, political debates. But we get backlash because initially when we started, the debates were in English. Now for literacy, given our literacy rates and the multiple languages, over the years, we've now evolved in doing multilingual debates. So you can watch it in English and also listen to it in your own local language so you can understand the conversation. So a lot more work just has to be done to ensure that more people have access and understand the issues and are not forced to vote based on an immediate need that poverty has created.
Some people say it's not compatible, democracy and growing economy. Sometimes people say it's a contradiction. If you want your economy to grow, democracies might not be the ideal system. Is that something anyone can respond to? Maybe Professor Rethinking?
It's a very good question, because we know, and there are a lot of discussions about Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore, for instance, and his ruling. More contradictions and more problems if we speak about, for instance, Chile. It's very, very painful experience. But the problem is that we have very limited experience of democracy. I think about just maybe less than 100 years. I'm speaking about equal electoral rights for everyone without census-related and other restrictions. For instance, in England, for example, women got equal electoral rights in 1928. In some North European countries, even later. In this case, it could, of course, be argued that democracy is just a local deviation in the context of the long history of humanity. Seriously, it's a great challenge. I understand and I share and values. It's the foundation of democracy, equal rights, opportunity to participate in big political game, a great political game, to be part of society and feel opportunity to influence on process. But the problem
thank you very much, Professor. Sorry, I have to move on now to an intervention from, I think, the United States by Professor Donald Emerson. He's the director of the South East Asia program at Stanford University. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, if I could change the subject a little bit, I mean, I'd like to come back to the commentary that we have received from our colleagues from Russia and China, but I think others have commented, and I'm happy to comment as well later on if there is time. But I wanted to try to give you a little bit of an empirical sort of orientation toward the current situation. If I could continue to use the terms autocracy and democracy, agreeing with those who I have said correctly that it's a complex subject, they don't line up easily. There are many different dimensions that go into a definition of what is a democracy and what is an autocracy. So we should keep that in mind. In particular, I could talk about others, there's not time, but a major aspect of that complexity is whether or not they have elections. And so if you take the countries that are either classified as autocracies or democracies and you stretch them out on a spectrum, what you will find is that in the middle of the spectrum, there are autocracies that have quote unquote elections, and there are democracies that have quote unquote elections. And to that extent, one would assume that both of those types of government seek legitimacy through elections, through some kind of participation. But the nature of the elections differ radically, because in the illiberal democracies, even though they have elections, there are really no guarantees of human rights. The secrecy of the ballot, for example, my right to run for office if I can be nominated and so forth, freedom of speech, which is critical in order to get the true feelings of both sides of a political contest. You have to vote for one or the other, and you'll be able to ask them embarrassing questions. Yes, I mean, obviously not questions that are insulting, but because any kind of dialogue in this context has to have limits, I admit that. And on the other hand, at the other end, the autocracies that have elections do not have those guarantees, whereas the liberal democracies do. And so what's happening is the liberal democracies are getting a little bit fewer, and the full-fledged closed autocracies, including, by the way, both China and Russia, are in some sense managing to maintain their position. However, if you take the two categories, this is quite important, and you consider the democracies, whether they have elections, whether they have civil right protections or not, and then you consider the autocracies, actually they're about even. It's about a 50-50 split. There are 88 autocracies by one definition. I'm borrowing this from VDEM, and there are 90 democracies. So it's really 50-50. So those that say that autocracies are winning or that democracies are winning, that is a fairly stable situation. I just want to say that in terms of the context here. And I guess the other comment I would make, and this does refer now to the comments we've heard from our colleagues from Russia and from China. There is a sense that democracy focuses on the process whereby leadership is formed, not just the electoral process, but the process that includes those human rights that guarantee that it's a free and fair process, right? And in a sense, the answer from the autocracies, including particularly Dr. Yang, and this is understandable given the success of China economically over the decades, really remarkable, double-digit growth and so forth, just extraordinary. So that rationale for what I would call an autocracy is that it produces, it delivers. In other words, it's an output-oriented. Whereas those who concentrate on civil rights and free and fair elections, the judicial process is another process in democracy. And sometimes the process goes on and on and on. And where is the product, right? Because one of the nice things about democracies is you can criticize your own country. If I criticize my country, even harshly, I'm not going to be arrested tomorrow, even though I have versions of rather harsh criticisms to make, especially with the possibility that next week, you know, the voice of the people, the midterm elections could leap into power, you know, and nobody else but Donald Trump himself, who belongs in jail, right? This man who was my president belongs in jail. I really believe that. And I can say that freely. And if I'm Chinese and I think the same thing about Xi Jinping, I cannot say that freely. I am not allowed to.
Thank you very much, Professor. That's a very strong point you're making, and I'm sure we will get some response to that. I am going to now introduce the next intervention made by David Coate. He's the head of advocacy and campaigns in Civicus. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Steph, and I really appreciate the contributions from colleagues that have come before me. They've made the conversation really exciting and interesting. Thank you to Global Count for this opportunity to speak for a few minutes. I think it's really, really interesting to listen to colleagues and get a sense of the arguments that they are making about democracies versus autocracies. But one thing I'd like to add to this conversation is that in focusing on, you know, the so-called big states, China, Russia, the United States, and so on and so forth, we may be missing opportunities that arise, you know, from smaller states or from states in other parts of the world. From the United Nations Security Council, leaving the General Assembly, the conversations are dominated by these big states, Russia, China. One of these countries often uses the veto. and it affects, either democracies or economies in smaller states. I think what citizens are looking for is to have a judiciary that can, arbitrate in cases where political actors and leaders and elite are not able to agree on the outcomes of certain processes, for example, elections. And Kenya is a very clear example a few months ago where the judiciary stepped in. But we're not having Kenya and the independence of the judiciary and what that means for democracy in Kenya and the region when we have these global conversations. I also think people are looking to live in a country where when they feel that an election was not well organized in terms of international standards, people can protest freely, express themselves, and again, the judiciary and the institutions of the state are able to intervene, as it happened in Malawi a couple of years ago. At the time when Malawian citizens changed the course of the democracy, where elections were held a few months before, and the courts ruled that they were not democratic and that they should be rerun, and that led to a change in government. The US was also facing an attack on its democratic institutions in a manner that we've not seen before. Again, the focus was on the US and less on Malawi. I guess the point I'm making is that while as global citizens and countries around the world, we focus on the big states, we focus on issues that, affect, whether it's China, the US, Russia, or the UK, we are missing opportunities where we see democratic transitions. We are missing opportunities where we see states moving from, smaller states moving from very close spaces or autocratic states to more democratic ones. So I think these conversations need to be balanced. I'll conclude by saying that 4 or 5 years ago, at least in 2019, we woke up to a world where in a country like Malaysia, a 65-year regime was broken and there was a political transition. In a country like Gambia, there was a transition from a dictatorial state, where a leader had been there for 20 years. And
yes, everything is fine. Everything is fine. No, everything is fine. Perfect.
Political
no,
participation. We're faced with a situation in a country like Ethiopia where there was a transition and there was an opening of space. Political leaders who had been jailed for decades were released. And fast forward to 4 years down the line, we have seen many of these countries that had open spaces and that had transitions digress and moved back to those closed spaces that they were before. So I'm saying that if we miss opportunities, including in smaller states, where there's political transitions to help citizens strengthen democratic institutions, so that when there's some restrictions that come back in the form of either laws or in the form of policies that are made by governments, these institutions would fight back. Then we will, in the next 10 years, still have these conversations about the war in Russia, about dictatorships across the world, about spaces that are closed. But I think the same way...
I'm sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry, we're running out of time, but you made your point very clear, I think. We can go now finally to France, because I think Nicolas is there with us. I'm not sure what you have been hearing so far, but please give your comments on this discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Steph. Sorry, I wasn't able just to hear, quite anything before the last gentleman was speaking. So basically I missed, what the other panelists were saying, but maybe you had a point about the question of the war. And for me, is it sometimes needed or even mandatory to go to war to protect democracy? I think yes, my answer is definitely yes. And for the sake of the world, for the sake of the very principle of democracy, for the sake of human rights, and for the sake of universal values. There are many things there. I think, first of all, I have to say that, in my view, when we are talking about the values of human rights, freedom, integrity, gender equality, all those values are not Western values, basically. they are not values only that that are valid, I mean, for the Western countries. For, I mean, some obvious reason. And the obvious reason is that we can witness in every part of the world people fighting for freedom and for human rights. The very idea that some countries are not mature or not ready for democracy of human rights is basically what we sometimes call Orientalism, which is a kind of racist idea, an imperial idea, and a colonial ideas. So I heard many people, you know, in Europe and also in France saying, for instance, well, let's consider, for instance, countries like China or Russia or Muslim countries or the Middle East. Those countries, those people will be never ready for democracy because of their heritage. And we know also that part of the Russian or Chinese propaganda is also based on.
Oh, he was making very good points, but now we
on
lost
the idea that there are many kinds of different civilizations and there is no model. Oh, sorry, I tried to repeat, sorry. Well, I mean, one of the points is that you have some people in Europe, also in France, writing that countries like, let's say, China, Russia, Muslim countries, Arabic countries, will be never mature enough or not ready for democracies. But this idea is enshrined in a kind of acceptation of the world, which is basically racist, colonial, imperialist. And in fact, you see people taking to the streets, in the streets of, let's say, Hong Kong, Taiwan, sometimes also some African countries, in Algeria, in Damascus, in all countries, whatever the religion is, whatever the culture is, whatever the legacy is, and those people are asking for freedom. And you see other countries today, like Russia, which is committing human war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes of genocide, like in Ukraine. It was also the case in Syria, where Russia killed more people than even ISIS did, in Georgia, in African countries. And I mean, if we consider a country that is committing war crimes, I mean, there is absolutely no questions if we have to fight against this country, if we have to change the regime of this country, whatever the country is.
I think that's a very good moment now to let Professor Brzezinski respond to this. He's talking to us from Russia. What do you say?
Yes, of course, we have a terrible problem with Western propaganda, you know, because unfortunately,
you call this Western propaganda? What?
Yes, a lot of examples of Western propaganda, because Western countries hate Russia. You have heard it, and it's prejudice, I think so. It's and its readiness to continue war. It's very interesting point. But I'd like to say
he was saying that Russia is committing war crimes. Do you agree with that?
It's according to opinion of previous colleague. But the problem
it's not opinion. It's not opinion. It's fact. It's fact. And I mean, I know the Russian propaganda. I mean,
it's fact in your mind, not more.
No. We cannot. I mean, we cannot be relativist. We cannot.
You say no. I say no.
Okay. I don't think we get an answer to this. This is going to be a yes or no discussion.
But I would like to say more important thing than typical example of Western propaganda. I would like to say about the problem
but Professor, can I rephrase the question? Because I don't think we're going to get anywhere with this. But what I want to ask you is what Mr. Tenzer is saying is that even also in Russia, people want democracy. I think that sums up his point. Can you respond to that?
People in Russia, of course, definitely, I think majority of them wants democracy, and they build this democracy according to their ideas and models. they are looking for happiness, they are looking for freedom and the freedom of speech.
And do they have that now? Do they have that freedom and freedom of speech?
It's a serious question. It's not for such kind of debate. We should check actual situation. From my point of view, there are enough freedom of speech in contemporary Russia, and there is not enough freedom of speech in contemporary social media. There is no a whiff of democracy in Facebook or Twitter or something else. Because it's not democratic platforms. It's extremely important instruments for communications, but at the same time, it's a problem of our common disinformation about reality. We need, if you like, we need a sort of journalistic renaissance and fact checking, because there are a lot of rumors, a lot of crazy ideas, and maybe situation is worse than in this media, but maybe much better. We need to feel reality. The main problem, from my point of view, is that
you made your point. Thank you very much. We now have to go to Sri Lanka because we have an intervention now from Rajiv Amarasuriya. Sorry, I might mispronounce your name. He's an attorney at law, immediate past secretary of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, I'm happy to be here as part of this very interesting discussion in relation to the coexistence of obviously two forms of distinct government. Prior to the pandemic, Sri Lanka was ranked the #1 travel destination by Lonely Planet. And post-pandemic this year, Sri Lanka hit the news for obviously the wrong reasons. If you follow international news, you might have formed a view that the citizens of Sri Lanka forced the resignation of an autocratic leader, President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, in July this year. But you may be surprised to hear that President Rajapaksa was elected as 8th executive president of Sri Lanka, polling 52% at an election in 2019, which was found to be largely fair. And the turnout also was above 80%. The present constitution of 1978 introduced an executive presidential system where the president is the head of state and also the head of government, with a parliament from which a prime minister and a cabinet of ministers is formed. On paper, the system imposes many checks and balances between the three organs of government, that is the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, to create a happy balance. However, from the very inception of the presidency in 1978, and for many years, the reality has been where the executive president is also the head of the political party that forms a majority in parliament and the party of the prime minister and the cabinet of ministers. Consequently, the check the parliament should have when the executive breaks down, and this is further exacerbated by the fact that appointments of the members of the highest judiciary was also by the president. It is in this backdrop that the parliament at the time in 2001 brought in the 17th Amendment to the Constitution, introducing many checks and balances and controls on the executive, especially in respect of appointments of senior officials. However, this is reversed, and we had U-turns of this concept going back and forth in the past 20 years. President Rajapaksa, in fact, had to resign from a very strong presidency. And interestingly, his successor, President Ranil Wickremesinghe, once more, under his direction, just last month, introduced the 21st Amendment, reducing some of his powers of president. So what I would like to, in this intervention, is to highlight that even in a good democracy, if the separation of powers between the three organs of state are not properly in place, and where no adequate checks and balances are embedded in the system, ground political realities could give rise to an envisaged democratic system of government becoming, in effect, an autocracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was actually in Colombo when Rajapaksa was chased away from his palace. And you could see that people were fed up because they were simply getting hungry and had no money to buy food or fuel. So thank you very much for this intervention. I want to give the floor again to Professor Donald Emerson to shine his light on what's been said by the last speakers.
Yes, I would actually, perhaps to the surprise of some of you, like to agree with something that Dr. Yang said, because I think it's quite important. Although I may be interpreting it a little differently than he meant to say. He said that over the period of thousands of years, and he undoubtedly had his own country in mind, because my country has not existed for thousands of years, In any case, it's time to take a new look at democracy. You used the word upgrade. Yeah, that's, I suppose, an optimistic view. I agree with you that democracy is, in many respects, as I argued, a process. And it's a process that can fail. It's an experiment. It's not a permanent sort of thing. Okay, there it is. You put it on the shelf and it'll always be there. No, no, no. It's a constant process of change and adaptation. And that's quite important. And I would go a little bit farther and say that insofar as China has done well economically at the level of output, the performance, despite a process that is quite undemocratic. I mean, forgive me for saying that, but that is my own view by my own definition of democracy. So that's an impressive performance, but notice how shaky a basis of legitimacy that is. Because now look at China, right? COVID zero. Look at the consequences of that on the Chinese economy. Earlier in one of the quarters of this year, the total annualized rate of growth of China's GDP was 0.4%, 0.4%, significantly much, much lower than the rate of growth, for example, of the United States. Now, I'm not saying that China is about to fall apart, but China has taken decisions, for example, chopping off the leadership of large firms, firms that are on the cutting edge of technological innovation. Is that a good performance act for China based on its performance legitimacy? No. Although it was a unanimous, I gather, approval of what could become, a kind of lifetime authorization to serve as the president of China and the Secretary General of the Chinese Communist Party. Nevertheless, I bet, I don't have any evidence to this effect, but there are people who are looking at China's performance and they're looking at it inside China and they're saying, what went wrong, right? And what can be done to correct that, right? It's the bad emperor problem. If you have a bad emperor...
Professor, thank you. I think you made your point. I think it would be fair now to have Dr. Wang respond.
Please.
Okay. Thank you, Donna, for agreeing that democracy is not universal and needs upgrade. I mean, as long as we agree on that, that's a lot of we solve a lot of puzzle. But I just give a case study. In the 1980s, India. Agree. We have to find a compatible size and population. 1.4 billion exactly. Two countries, over 1 billion. India in 1980s, China was in par with the GDP. Income. Now China is 5 times of India. India is a world-recognized largest democracy, but didn't perform. So what I meant is that the democracy needs really upgrade and progress, because also another thing we haven't taken into consideration is the culture. Western are more individual oriented, more individualism. China is more collectivism, more collective action. So there's a lot of Chinese culture, there's not many people very articulate, very talkative, but in the Western society, that's really a good advantage. So we have to take all this into consideration. But as far as the zero COVID policy concerned, I think China has gone so far. Hong Kong is open 0 to 3. Hong Kong is part of China. I think that China, just quarterly 3.9, third quarter GDP growth, better than people expected. I think China will make up and will change, for the right direction also. So I think that as long as we have all the infrastructure there, all the element there, all the synergy there. So if China can perform constantly well and produce over 38% of the global GDP growth, I should let it be. China also trying to contribute more to the world now. China is the second largest donor after the United States to the UN system now. So we have to really see.
Dr. Wang, thank you very much. That's a very good point. I think we will take this all to the floor later on for all the panelists. I have another guest from Iran now. It's Zoreh Mohammadi, sorry. He's a researcher at the Tehran International Studies and Research Institute, and the floor is yours.
Everyone. Hello, everyone. Morning from Tehran. Thank you for interesting discussion. I really and actually use from the interesting discussion. Actually, when we discuss about the words as autocracies, we as democracies suddenly I remember about the bipolar words or paradoxical words. Actually, we live in a world where decades ago, states sought equality for their nations. But based on the indicators they made paradoxical or bipolar words like West-East, North-South, democratic, autocracies word. And this word made to describe the world and the state nations. While the main issue was that the ruling states that are developed, democratic, North or democratic states themselves started to violate their rules. For example, I say you an example. From one side, the so-called South countries were introduced as states seek war states, while the North state, the democratic states, the West states took them to the war or made the plans or context to take them to the war, which people have to pay its cost. And from other side, the northern states got defeat means from people, from states. Without considering the states, without considering the nations, Russia or China or France or which states are democratic, which one is autocracy, which one is developed, which one is West, which one is East. I think that the main issue is these words are constructed. I think the most point in the world, in the contemporary world, is facing the paradoxical, bipolar the world, not only in the word, but in the practice.
Okay, sorry to interrupt you. I think our time is running out, but thank you for your contribution. There's of course a lot going on where you are at the moment. I'm now going to the Philippines.
You're welcome.
I'm going to Ronel Danila Young from the New Era University. Please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. From Manila, thank you so much for this opportunity to speak and intervene on this very interesting discussion. As a student of international relations, my view on democracy and the meaning of democracy can be very subjective. And I grew up in a country where democracy has been an important topic and freedom and prioritization of human rights. Majority in this region, especially in ASEAN countries, may not be able to relate with this topic of this debate, and which is democracy versus autocracy, because democracy in this region is winning so far. Now, most of the countries in this region treat democracy as a vital part of society, and power is in the people, and there shouldn't be any leader that should abuse power. Rule of law is the essence of democracy, and countries struggle to achieve democracy, and we should also be there to with the people to struggle. And achieving consensus, the importance of leadership, particularly in Southeast Asia, which has a history of strong authoritarian leaders who forged their nation after independence. While many in Southeast Asia still feel that economic growth is more important than democracy itself, and that democracies promotes economic growth more successfully than autocracies, and that citizens in poor democracies have better education and healthcare than those in poor autocracies. But with this in mind, with this question would be for Ms. Yemi Adamolekun. I was very interested with the topic we discussed earlier, and it was mentioned that educated people tend to express democracy in a more profound manner. They tend to choose leaders personally that's good for their country. Do you think people could have been more educated on how to exercise their own power? Especially with the presence of social media, people can be driven to believe in fake news. In my country, this is a very serious problem, and where this served as a very important topic in the most recent election in our country. And one last question, do you also think that this is a consequence of democracy? Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your contribution from the Philippines. We have now listened to all the contributions from all over the world, very interesting from all corners, I would say. I want to go now to give the floor to everyone also who is listening in, not only the panelists to come up with questions, but I want to give the panelists and first of all, Yemi, the floor to respond to everything that's been said and the questions just asked to you, but please keep it very short. We have around 15 minutes, I think, left. So if you keep it really within a minute, that would help. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, wanted to respond certainly to Professor Audrey, who mentioned when he couldn't answer clearly about freedom of expression in Russia, and then spoke interestingly about fact-checking and the use of the media. And the way Russian companies have used media for elections haven't been very positive. So I thought that was really very, very interesting. And the back and forth with him and Mr. Tenza on war crimes, that's just it's fact. It's not an opinion. It's not a conversation about opinion. And to Ronel's question, I certainly think that people can be taught, and there's an embedded assumption that people understand the process of democracy, so that's how they vote. But if you, and this is again to Dr. Wang's point about delivering outputs, democracy doesn't equal development, but in the absence of development, you affect your democratic outcomes.
Thank you very much. Who wants to respond to this? Maybe, yeah, okay. Erna Solberg, please, from Seoul. You're muted, I think. Are you muted? You're muted.
Yes, I'm not. I managed to unmute too. It's after 2 years of pandemic, you should believe that you have learned this by now. Can I say, I think there sometimes is, of course, a phrasing words. I think there are differences in history, in culture, backgrounds for why we have the systems that we have. But we also have an agreement called the UN, the whole Charter of Human Rights that most countries in the world have aligned to. And I do in fact say that power comes out of the individual. It comes out of the rights that every individual have. I think we should take this with us as the ideal also in the future. And I just say you cannot have a democracy without you having freedom of speech and freedom of the press, and you can have and that you have some kind of alternative power structures, people who can question, who are independent of the government. And I think that's where the challenge is. You have to have transparency, and you have to have division of power to manage a democracy that is functioning as a democracy. And I think, I'm sorry to say, but I think Russia is going the wrong way. I mean, they have closed down all of those news agencies that were critical, that were looking at corruption, that were looking at what the government was doing. Novaya Gazeta, which the editor won the Nobel Prize 2 years ago, was closed down last year. It's moving in the wrong direction. And I also appreciate a lot what's happening in China when it comes to the social development for people. One of the reasons why we reached the Millennium Development Goals on people living in absolute poverty was the Chinese movement of people out of poverty. But it still means it's not a democratic state when it doesn't have any alternatives to question the power that are independent. And I think maybe democracy is short in history spans up until now. I will just say that Vikings had a sort of democracy. They did fight a lot, so 1,000 years ago, and I think you go back and find communities with sorts of democracy early on. But I still believe it's so important that we acknowledge the fact that countries that are without a type of independent monitoring from other bodies tend to become more corrupt, less prudent of the peoples, and are falling back on delivering on those who are the poorest.
Thank you very much. Professor Brzezinski, 1 minute to respond.
First of all, I'm against malignant simplification because we should collect information, understand it, and later make conclusions. I think it's not it's no sense to discuss how many agencies in Russia criticize government. It's you can check everything, but more important is that the main challenge it's about democracy and autocracy. The problem is that in contemporary world we see very interesting situation. Some years ago, Milovan Djilas, former vice prime minister of Yugoslavia during Tito time, wrote book New Ruling Class. He mentioned that in socialist Yugoslavia, Communist Party was not ruling force. Workers, working class was not ruling. He mentioned that there is a small interlinear group between everything. We see approximately the same situation in contemporary social networks. Administrators, even owners doesn't have so influence. Administrators, special secretariats, small media, bloggers, we have a problem of hierarchy of contemporary societies. And I absolutely agree with colleagues that we need a sort of new concept of democracy, because.
Okay, I think that's it for your minute. Sorry, I want now to go to Mr. Tenzer to respond. A minute as well.
Yes, thank you very much. Just 3 brief points. The first point is that basically when you have in a country repression at home, very often, especially for the major countries, very predictive of aggression abroad. And I think it's very important to have this view. When a country is just suppressing the basic freedoms, imprisoning its dissidents, then quite often it goes hand in hand with the aggressions of other countries. My second point is that we need to have democracy, we need a justice, full justice, and especially for the guilty ones of crimes against humanity, war crimes, crimes of aggressions, crime of genocide. There must be a full justice. If there is no world justice, there will be no democracy. And the third thing is that we Democrats, in every part of the world, we have to support the freedom fighters. We have to fight for the people imprisoned in Russia, like my great friend, Vladimir Kara-Murza, Ilya Yashin, Alexei Navalny. We have to fight alongside the women in Tehran and in other parts of Iran. We have to fight alongside the people of the Xinjiang, the Uyghur, persecuted by People's Republic of China. We have to fight alongside the people of Hong Kong, alongside the people of Myanmar. And I think it's very important that those fights are not falling into the holes of oblivion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Wang, please, your comments.
Yes, I think that just to conclude, I agree that we really have to safeguard the multilateral system, the UN system, all those global systems that we established since World War II, actually. But I think, one of the things, for example, we talk about human rights, but, we have to really build up a consensus among all 193 countries and regions in this world to really work together. I think there's one thing that we all agreed upon is that 193 countries and regions unanimously voted the 2030 agenda, 17 objectives. Let's use that 17 criteria as a benchmark, as a criteria for human rights, social development, lift poverty, equal employment, equal rights for women, all those things. That's really human right. I also want to say that in the end, it's matter, it doesn't matter democracy takes what kind of form and shape, what kind of history and what kind of background, how large is the population size. In the end, it's to satisfy the happiness of these people, the pursuit of the better life of its people. That's really the bottom line. I don't think there's any other thing can replace. We're not talking for democracy's purpose. We have to use that democracy to build a better world and better life for the people. That's the fundamental bottom line. We have to stick to that. So if Chinese people felt they are last 7 decades, their life expectancy has doubled. Now their life expectancy is longer than the United States. They have to really, the government is delivering, and that's the better shape, and that's the way they choose. I think we have to respect that.
Thank you very much. It's about the happiness of the people. Professor Emerson, what do you think?
Yeah, very quickly. Well, there's much in what Dr. Wang said that I agree with. I do want to remind him that a performance legitimacy based on economic progress ignores the fact that people do not live by bread or rice alone, right? People are more than just consumers of food, right? It's good that they are not going hungry, don't misunderstand, but a human being has multiple dimensions. A human being should be able to think and read and enjoy life, not just to be the recipient of some
I just want to
gross domestic product. But I do have, no, wait a minute, I'm sorry. I haven't quite finished. Leaving this aside, I have 2 concerns that I would like to share. My first concern is that the China model, based on performance legitimacy, based on GDP growth, right? Remember that the Gini index in China is just as bad as it is in the United States. Economic inequality is just as bad as it is the United States. I worry about economic inequality, and I worry that we will end up with a version of what Kishore Mahbubani said earlier. Some of you may have seen and heard him say this just a couple of hours ago. His motto is meritocracy, pragmatism, and honesty. He calls it MPH. And my answer to that is no, there's a missing A, the A for accountability. How can you have a meritocracy if the people who are at the, I'm a professor, right? I work with people who are highly educated. Some of them couldn't administer their way out of a paper bag. They don't have practical knowledge, right? And he talks about pragmatism, but what about principles? The principle that even a person who is not that educated deserves autonomy, freedom, a right to life, right? Not just to be on the receiving end of decisions made by some sort of meritocratic elite. And then finally, what I would say is this: if you look into the future, I'll make a prediction. My prediction is that in the coming decades, there'll be something that I would like to call statification, the growth of the state. We can already see it in terms of the response to COVID-19, and there will be other panics, right, associated with viral developments. We can see it in the industrial policies followed, for example, by China. China, instead of engaging in economic reform, building up the state-owned corporations, even though their productivity is absolutely miserable. The growth of the state is just extraordinary, and not just in China, but in many other countries. Another example, of course, is global warming. How can you fight global warming except by organizing the state? And in that context, it seems to me democracy becomes even more valuable because it includes the people.
Thank you very much. And I think Dr. Wang has the right to give us a few words in response before I close the session.
Sure. Thank you. I think I just want to say 2 things. You talk about life of the Chinese people. I'll give you an example. Before the pandemic, there was 150 million Chinese in the outbound tours around the world. 150 million people return. I mean, you say they don't have a freedom. I just use that one example. The other thing is that the China is not totally state enterprise. The Chinese is a unique hybrid economy. 60% private sectors provide 90% employment, 20% SOE provide disasters, poverty alleviation, and all those public global public affairs stuff. Another 20% supply 50% of China's import export. That's a very unique hybrid economy, and that's where the China wants to work on a common prosperity, avoid economic
reform. Thank you Thank you very much. I think we have to leave it here. I really enjoyed this vibrant discussion from all over the world. I don't think we've got an answer to democracies versus autocracies. It's indeed not simple, but I'm very delighted to see that we're actually speaking to each other, and that's very important. I think we just seriously have to continue to do that. It's been touching to see all of you today, and thank you so much for your contributions. Keep up the good fight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.